50,000 men are marching through the baking heat of an alien desert, and within 24 hours, they will produce enough human waste to trigger a biological apocalypse. This is the ultimate, unspoken terror of ancient warfare. An army is a mobile, self-devouring city that rots from the inside out. You have been taught that empires fall to superior tactics, ambushes, or supply shortages. That is a comforting lie. The cold, putrid reality is that most ancient armies were annihilated by their own excrement. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid slaughtered more conquerors than any sword, spear, or catapult ever forged. When 50,000 bodies relieve themselves every single day without modern sanitation, the groundwater turns to poison, the air becomes a vector for disease, and the camp transforms into a slaughterhouse of the bowels. And yet, the Roman legions marched through the most hostile environments on earth, from the frozen swamps of Germania to the blistering sands of Syria, and they did not collapse. They did not drown in their own filth. The secret to Roman supremacy was not iron discipline, nor was it the famous gladius. It was a ruthless, obsessive, almost psychopathic devotion to the management of human waste. The Romans understood an empirical truth that the rest of the world would forget for 1,000 years. If you do not conquer your own filth, your filth will conquer you. They turned sanitation into a tactical weapon, an unyielding doctrine implemented with the same brutal efficiency as a cavalry charge. Every time a legion halted, they waged war against biology itself. The infrastructure they built to survive the mundane act of defecation is more staggering than the Colosseum, and infinitely more important to the survival of the empire. But how did Rome manage a biological time bomb that decimated every other civilization of their era? The answer begins before a single tent is even pitched, and it will shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient warfare. Long before the exhausted foot soldiers of a Roman legion arrived at the site of their new encampment, a shadowy team of specialists had already claimed the ground. These were the Mensores, the army's elite surveyors and mathematical engineers. Their primary objective was not to scout for enemy ambushes or defensive choke points. Their job was to impose the brutal, unyielding geometry of Rome upon the chaotic wilderness. The Roman military camp, the castra, was never a random collection of tents pitched wherever the ground looked soft. It was a precise, grid-locked machine, a pre-calculated blueprint replicated with terrifying exactness whether the legion was freezing in Britannia or sweating in Judea. Every cohort, every century, every pack animal had a designated, non-negotiable coordinate. But the very first calculation the Mensores made, the anchor point of their entire survival strategy, was the placement of the latrines. This was not a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life and death. The Mensores applied a strict, unforgiving logic to the topography. Even without the slightest understanding of microscopic pathogens or germ theory, Roman engineers knew that human waste had to be completely isolated from the two pillars of survival: food and water. Therefore, the latrines were exclusively positioned at the absolute lowest elevation of the camp perimeter. This ensured that when it rained, the toxic runoff flowed away from the sleeping quarters and the grain storage, never toward them. They mapped the prevailing seasonal winds of the region to ensure the latrines were permanently downwind, keeping the fetid air out of the soldiers' lungs. Most crucially, the latrines were placed downstream from any water source the army intended to use. This wasn't guesswork. This was an ironclad military doctrine. But finding the perfect spot was only the beginning. What these engineers built next in the mud and the rock was an architectural marvel that defies belief. If you imagine a Roman soldier simply dropping his armor and digging a crude hole in the dirt, you are vastly underestimating the mechanical obsession of the empire. On permanent campaign bases and fortified frontier positions, the Romans constructed full-scale, permanent stone latrine complexes that rival modern public facilities. Archaeological excavations at Hadrian's Wall, at the frigid outposts in Germany, and deep in the mud of Vindolanda have unearthed the physical remains of these structures, and they are chilling in their sophistication. A typical permanent military latrine was a massive, rectangular stone bunker built directly over a deep, engineered trench. Lining the walls were thick stone or wooden benches featuring dozens of perfectly rounded, keyhole-shaped openings, spaced merely inches apart. There were no stalls, there were no partitions. There was absolutely zero privacy. Dozens of heavily armed, battle-hardened killers sat shoulder to shoulder, relieving themselves in a synchronized communal ritual. Modern observers often recoil at this lack of modesty, but for the legionary, the concept of privacy was an irrelevant luxury. The Roman military was a monolithic, collective organism. They bathed together, they ate from the same pot, they bled together in the shield wall. The latrine was simply another shared space, a hub of gossip, complaints, and camaraderie. But the true genius lay beneath them. Running continuously under the seats was a channeled stream of fast-moving water, a mechanical flush that operated 24 hours a day, sweeping the waste out of the compound. And running in a shallower trench at knee level was a second, crystal-clear stream of water. This was dedicated solely to the washing of the xylospongium, the infamous sponge on a stick that served as Roman toilet paper. To modern eyes, this shared tool looks like a sanitary nightmare. But this disgusting communal sponge held a strategic secret that literally saved millions of lives. The genius of the Roman latrine system cannot be separated from their tyrannical mastery of water. The two were inextricably linked in a cycle of survival. Every permanent Roman fort, every long-term siege camp, required access to flowing water as a non-negotiable prerequisite. The Romans were supreme empiricists. They observed that stagnant ponds bred death, while rushing streams maintained health. When natural water sources were insufficient to meet their demanding criteria, Roman engineers simply bent nature to their will. They built massive, complex aqueducts in the middle of active war zones. Consider the apocalyptic siege of Masada in the desolate Judean desert. The Romans didn't just build a wall to starve out the rebels. They engineered a sprawling network of cisterns, aqueducts, and flash flood catchments in one of the driest places on Earth, purely to supply their own siege camps with flowing water. This captured water was never allowed to sit idle. It was directed through a meticulously designed flow-through system. It entered the high ground of the fort, pristine and pure, allocated first for drinking and cooking. Then it was routed to the balnei, the sprawling military bathhouses, to wash the sweat and grime from thousands of men. Finally, the gray water was aggressively diverted into the deep trenches beneath the latrines, serving as the relentless hydraulic engine that flushed the accumulated waste of a legion out into the wilderness. The camp was not a closed loop, it was an open valve. Nothing was allowed to stagnate. The waste was forced out of the human environment at a speed dictated by physics and gravity. But having access to this rushing water wasn't enough. The Romans had to weaponize it on a personal level, and their next step in enforcing hygiene was nothing short of obsessive. Bathing in the Roman army was not a luxury, nor was it a reward for a hard day's march. It was mandatory medical policy, enforced by the lash if necessary. The balnei, or bathhouses, were standard features of any permanent Roman installation, and their scale was staggering. At numerous frontier forts across the empire, the bathhouse was deliberately constructed as the single largest building in the entire complex. It was larger than the commander's palatial quarters. It was larger than the vital granaries that stored their food. This architectural priority speaks volumes about Roman military doctrine. The Medici, the specialized military physicians attached to the legions, understood through ruthless observation that a soldier with clean skin was a soldier who did not die from minor abrasions. Scrubbing away the dirt, sweat, and feces reduced the incidence of lethal skin infections, prevented minor battle wounds from festering into gangrene, and somehow kept mysterious fevers at bay. But here is the twist that historians rarely emphasize. The Romans achieved this unparalleled level of epidemiological control while being fundamentally wrong about how diseases actually worked. They had no microscopes. They had never heard of a bacteria or a virus. The leading medical minds of the empire, figures like Galen, operated on the miasma theory, the completely erroneous belief that illness was caused by bad air emanating from rotting organic matter. Galen was dead wrong about the biological mechanism, but his practical, reactionary conclusion was flawless. The fear of bad air drove the Romans to obsessively bury their waste, scrub their bodies, and flush their latrines with moving water. They constructed the most effective public health apparatus in the ancient world, based entirely on a hallucination. But what happened when the legions left their stone fortresses and marched into the wild, where aqueducts and stone benches didn't exist? The reality of the temporary field camp was even more brutal. When a legion was on the move, advancing deep into enemy territory, they built a fully fortified marching camp every single night. And every single night, the hygiene protocols were enforced with the exact same draconian severity. The late Roman military theorist Vegetius, in his monumental manual Epitoma Re Militaris, leaves no room for interpretation. He explicitly mandates that the latrine trenches must be fully excavated before a single sleeping tent is erected. The men could be starving, they could be bleeding, they could be exhausted to the point of collapse after a 20-mile forced march, but they dug the shit trenches first. These field latrines were deep, standardized ditches positioned strictly outside the main defensive perimeter, yet close enough to be guarded. The discipline regarding these trenches was absolute. A Roman soldier was explicitly forbidden from relieving himself anywhere else in the surrounding wilderness. To break this rule was to invite severe physical punishment from a centurion's vine staff. Furthermore, Roman doctrine explicitly warned against camping in the exact same location for too long. Vegetius noted that even with perfectly dug latrines, prolonged occupation of a temporary site eventually allowed the invisible taint of waste to seep into the surrounding soil and corrupt the groundwater. Therefore, a marching army had to constantly uproot and move, staying one step ahead of its own accumulating filth. This level of micromanagement, this obsessive policing of where a man is allowed to empty his bowels, seems almost psychopathic to the modern mind. Until, of course, you look at what happened to the legendary armies who chose to ignore it. Let us examine the supposedly glorious armies of the Greeks and Macedonians. For all their philosophical brilliance and tactical genius, their approach to military sanitation was a death sentence. Greek city-state hoplites on campaign possessed absolutely no standardized sanitation protocols. When a Spartan or an Athenian needed to relieve himself, he simply wandered to the edge of the camp and squatted wherever it was convenient. The result was catastrophic. During the Peloponnesian War, this lack of discipline transformed the besieged city of Athens into a festering biological reactor. The historian Thucydides provides a nightmare account of the Plague of Athens in 430 BC. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, fueled by the haphazard disposal of human waste and corpses, accelerated the disease with apocalyptic speed. Men died covered in pustules, violently expelling their own fluids, wiping out a quarter of the Athenian population and permanently breaking their strategic dominance. Even Alexander the Great, the supposed pinnacle of ancient military commanders, was a biological fool. His legendary march into India and his subsequent retreat through the blistering Gedrosian desert was an unmitigated disaster of disease. Alexander's forces, suffering from collapsing morale, abandoned whatever basic camp discipline they had. They drank from stagnant, contaminated pools. They marched through their own waste. Consequently, the primary killer of the invincible Macedonian army was not the war elephants of King Porus or the arrows of desert tribesmen. It was dysentery and typhoid. They conquered the known world, only to die convulsing in the sand, leaking bloody fluids from their bowels. You would think humanity learned a lasting lesson from these horrific, preventable losses. But the terrifying truth is, the worst biological disasters in military history were yet to come. Fast forward 1,000 years, past the fall of Rome, into the era of the Crusades and the supposedly advanced medieval period. The regression of human knowledge during this time is staggering. European armies of the Middle Ages were vast, unwashed hordes that effectively operated as mobile plagues. Accounts from the First Crusade describe military camps that devolved into disease-ridden wastelands within mere weeks of being established. At the horrific siege of Antioch in 1097, the Christian army literally rotted in place. They dumped their excrement, rotting animal carcasses, and human corpses directly into the very river they used for drinking water. The ensuing outbreak of the bloody flux, severe bacterial dysentery, slaughtered the Crusaders with an efficiency the Muslim defenders could only dream of. Men literally expelled the lining of their own intestines, dying in agonizing, dehydrated delirium. This nightmare repeated itself for centuries. During the 100 Years' War, English and French armies were routinely crippled by cant fevers. As late as the 17th century, during the apocalyptic carnage of the 30 Years' War, more than a millennium after Roman military hygiene peaked, armies were still being annihilated by preventable diseases. Statistical analyses of pre-modern European warfare reveal a grim ratio. For every single soldier killed by a bullet, a pike, or a cannonball, 2 to 3 soldiers died in agony from camp diseases. Millions of men were wiped off the face of the earth simply because their commanders had forgotten how to dig a properly placed ditch. They blamed their agonizing deaths on divine punishment, on witchcraft, on bad luck. So, how did the greatest, most effective sanitation system in the history of human warfare simply vanish into the dark? The uncomfortable reality is that Roman military hygiene was never a natural evolution of human culture. It was an artificial, heavily enforced, institutional achievement. It was a machine that required constant, terrifying discipline to maintain. As the Western Roman Empire began to politically and economically contract in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the structural integrity of the military loosened. The massive legions were broken down into smaller, localized units. Highly trained heavy infantry were replaced by cheap, irregular barbarian mercenaries who had zero interest in Roman engineering. The elaborate infrastructure of the permanent stone forts, the aqueducts, the bathhouses, the flushing latrines, crumbled because the central authority could no longer afford to maintain them. The Mensores and the Medici still existed on imperial payrolls, but in the muddy reality of the decaying frontier, the standards evaporated. We know exactly how this decay happened, because the surviving Eastern Roman Empire documented it. 6th century Byzantine military manuals, such as the Strategicon, attributed to Emperor Maurice, contain hygiene regulations clearly plagiarized from earlier Roman doctrines. But these texts are filled with bitter complaints. The authors explicitly lament that these vital sanitary rules are no longer being followed by the contemporary troops. They beg their officers to enforce latrine discipline, proving that the theoretical knowledge had survived, but the iron will to enforce it had died. A system without enforcement is just archaeology waiting to happen. The Romans didn't suddenly forget that drinking feces was bad. The institution simply lost the power to punish the men who were too lazy to dig. The knowledge was buried in the mud alongside the empire, and it would take a global catastrophe in the 19th century to finally unearth it. It took humanity nearly 1,500 years to relearn what a Roman centurion knew in the 2nd century BC. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, the British Army was bleeding to death in its own hospitals. Soldiers who survived the brutal combat at Sevastopol were sent to medical wards only to die of cholera and typhus in staggering numbers. Enter Florence Nightingale. She is canonized in history books as the saintly pioneer of modern nursing. But strip away the romantic mythology and look at what she actually did. Nightingale aggressively compiled data proving that preventable diseases caused by horrific sanitation were killing exponentially more men than Russian artillery. Her revolutionary reforms were shockingly simple. She demanded clean water. She mandated proper, isolated waste disposal. She forced the ventilation of foul air out of the wards. In essence, she essentially resurrected the exact empirical doctrines that Galen and Vegetius had hardwired into the Roman military machine millennia prior. She was hailed as a medical visionary, a savior of the modern age. But in reality, she was acting as the ghost of a forgotten Roman engineer, reinstating the brutal logic of the Mensores. The wheel of history had taken 15 centuries of agonizing, feces-stained death to turn full circle. The modern world finally realized that an army's deadliest weapon is its plumbing. Here is the cold, cynical truth about the Roman war machine. They did not conquer the known world simply because they had sharper swords, thicker armor, or more brilliant generals. They dominated the ancient world because they cracked the ultimate biological code of survival. They kept their killers alive long enough to actually reach the battlefield. While barbarian hordes and rival empires were shitting themselves to death in their own contaminated camps, the Roman legionary was sitting on a stone bench, wiping himself with a communal sponge, completely isolated from the dysentery that should have killed him. This was not born out of a desire for comfort or some enlightened squeamishness about dirt. It was cold, calculated military arithmetic. An army that does not hemorrhage manpower to cholera has more men to hold the line. An army that does not waste its logistical trains treating the dying can use those wagons to haul more arrows and grain. A soldier who knows he will be fed, bathed, and kept free from the bloody flux fights with a terrifying, unshakable morale. The humble latrine trench was the ultimate force multiplier. So, the next time you wander through the ruins of a Roman fort, bypass the armory. Ignore the commander's villa. Look for the damp, sunken trench in the corner of the compound. Stare down into the latrine block. You are not looking at a historical curiosity or a crude joke. You are looking at the foundational pillar of the greatest military empire in human history. Rome was built on blood, iron, and a psychopathic obsession with sewage. Welcome to the grim reality of ancient survival.